you for joining us for today's Ipsos webinar, exploring Canadian consumption behaviors and opportunities for brands to authentically connect with them. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Mauricio Vieira, Vice President in Ipsos's Market Strategy and Understanding Research Team. Mauricio, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ellen. And thank you everyone for attending. If you're from Toronto on this rainy afternoon, as Ellen mentioned, my name is Mauricio Vieira. I am a Vice President for the Food and Beverage Syndicated Team, part of the Market Strategy and Understanding service line here at Ipsos. And as the title suggests, today we are here to talk about beverages, but I don't want to focus just on which categories are growing and declining. Today's webinar really draws from an extensive report that focuses on understanding how the generational shift is fundamentally impacting the beverage landscape. And here, we can't talk about beverages without talking about generations. But sometimes understanding generations can be tricky. First, there's always the marketing buzz around generations. In the early 2000s, there was a lot of that millennial craze. Nowadays, a lot is talked about Gen Z. They're really hot, or I guess as they would say nowadays, lit or fire. But as we'll see, while the Gen Z as a cohort is very relevant, they're also far from the majority. Secondly, it's also important when talking about generations to understand the differences between what are life stage effects. So as an example, younger cohorts, regardless of when, tend to be more social and exercise more. But how do we differentiate between those life stage effects from genuine cohort effects? You can also throw in different things that are specific to Canada, such as location. Canada has a lot of immigrants and new Canadians, so a millennial that was born in China and saw the economic boom there and moved to Canada in their 30s will probably have a very different outlook from someone that was born in Canada, a millennial that was born in Canada and grew up here. Which brings to the third point, which when we're talking about Canada, it's really hard to separate any generational dynamic discussion from the changing multicultural landscape. In a lot of places in the Western world, we see population declining. It's not happening in Canada, but it's only due to the arrival of new Canadians. So that means that a lot of the younger cohorts are increasingly more multicultural, which will continue to shape our beverage choices. And this is an important point also because it differentiates us from the US. Many times we see reports on North American trends, but Canada is unique and will continue to become more unique. So understanding generations isn't always easy, but when done correctly and through facts, it really enables us to understand a lot of driving forces behind both societal and consumption changes. So when we're talking about generations, just here to define them, put everyone on the same field, we're looking at Gen Alpha, which is your kids under 9. We have Gen Z separated in 2, your trailing Gen Zs, which account for your preteens and your teens. You also have lead Gen Z, which are between now your young adults entering the workforce. Same thing with millennials. We're not just looking at them from a trailing and leading perspective. Due to the difference in their life stage, we're looking at millennials with no kids and millennials with kids, that cohort between 25 and 40. Then you have your Gen X, which is roughly around 40 to 60 years old, and your Boomers Plus, which constitute senior citizens over 55 years old. There's a component of silent generation over 75, but the majority of it are still boomers. Okay. And today, on the very limited time that we have, we are touching on a couple of the following points from our broader report. But first we'll look at how the generational differences really impact the beverage landscape. Then we'll take a deeper dive into other forces that are influencing beverage choices. So this will be conscious consumption and the evolving situational factors. And while we will cover a lot of category-related insights in these 2 points, they are broader and talk about beverage and insights on a more broader lens. So for the third point, we will aim to provide a little bit more of a quick summary in terms of some key category developments and immediate takeaways that you can all have. So if you're asking yourself what a beverage group is, we are looking today at some macro groups that will include cold beverages, hot beverages, and alcohol beverages. To do this report and this webinar, we are really looking and deriving our outlook from a multitude of sources. So here in Ipsos, within the food and beverage syndicated group, we have 3 main studies. 5, which captures eating and drinking behavior across all categories and all venues. We have our FSM, which is our food service monitor. That's an ongoing daily tracker about what consumers sourced from food service the day prior. And we also have our alcohol tracking from ACT, which captures alcohol consumption in Canada across different venues. So really, it's a multitude of sources, and again, a truly Canadian voice, the voice of Canadian consumers, diners, and drinkers. So getting into our beverage landscape. Here, if this was a standard beverage landscape, I would start by showing at a high level what is happening to the total drinkings, here using total drinkings per capita, and also understanding what is happening to the share of throat of some of the main commercial beverages. But as I mentioned today, we aren't here to just talk about tap water and which categories are growing and declining, because this doesn't show the full picture. If we are going to take one key takeaway as it relates to tap water, the most important thing for people to keep in mind is that tap water is mainly present in snacking occasions. And by snacking occasions here, I mean anything that isn't a meal, that isn't breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So we see that they constitute 70% of the tap water servings. So with the growth of tap water, even if it's growing in meals, it means that it's pushing commercial beverages towards meals and in particularly to dinner. Okay, so with that out of the way, we'll look a little bit more beneath the surface for commercial beverages to understand the reality that is a little bit more complex and nuanced. Because as we mentioned, generations will play a huge role in how the beverage landscape shapes out. We don't all drink the same. So when we look at our generations here, and looking first at the annual drinkings per capita of commercial beverages, what you can see is that people will drink more as the generations go up, right? So you really start young, smaller with Generation Alpha, and it progressively goes up, peaking at Gen X, but still staying pretty high with Boomers. But this is just the amount that they're drinking. When we look at the consideration set, you can see that the trend is pretty much the opposite. Here, when we're looking at the share of throat proportionate to total population, we see that the development of category choices follows the different direction. So we see a wider number for younger cohorts, peaking pretty much at leading Gen Z in terms of the offerings that they choose from, and it really fizzles out as you get to older cohorts. So this means that while Boomers and Gen X are the biggest drinkers, it's concentrated in fewer categories. The implication of this is that the competition for share of throat is much more robust among younger population and in a smaller share of the pie. Beyond that, it's not only the consideration set that is different, but the needs driving them behind also. So cross-generational, when we're talking about beverages, obviously thirst and hydration are some of the top needs, but beneath the surface, we see that this plays out differently by generation. So you'll see that for Gen Alpha and trailing Gen Z, focuses a lot around health. When we're looking at leading Gen Z and millennials with no kids, portability becomes something really important. Where we're talking about millennials with kids, a lot of that emotional reward becomes important. With Gen X, you see the development of other needs such as mental uplift. And when we're talking about Boomers, really ritual and convenience become really important. And here, when we're talking for those that have kids at home, you might be thinking that, sometimes under 9 and teenagers aren't super health oriented, but we have to keep in mind here that parents are the gatekeepers, and without necessarily a lot of purchase power, they are more limited to what parents will buy to them. So there's interesting to understand a few of these different motivations behind each one of the generations. So, we looked at the drinking rate, we look at the consideration set and the needs, but where does the consumption of these commercial beverages happen? I know this necessarily isn't super sexy, sometimes, especially for the marketers in the room, but reality is when we're looking at share of throat, Gen X and Boomers still account for 50% of the share of throat. But this is just the sizing. If we add up millennials, trailing Gen Z, you also get sizable cohorts. But it's important to mention at least once that a lot of these older cohorts that aren't sometimes priority still have a large share of throat. But again, this is just the size. When we look at the momentum, things start to change. So taking a look at what has happened since the pandemic, a couple of things may have happened since the pandemic, but as a basic exercise, what we did was getting the annual drinkings per capita that we saw before and multiplying it by the Canadian population at the time. With that, we can estimate the total number of drinkings or servings that happen in Canada. So you see that from today compared to the pandemic, the annual drinkings per capita, as we saw, decreased around 7%. The Canadian population in the same period increased 4%, growing 2 million Canadians. And when we look at this variation from the total number of drinkings, what we saw is that there has been a decrease of around 3%, going from close to 70 billion drinkings to 67 billion. But again, this doesn't mean it's declining consistently across all cohorts and categories. This really is a combination of different things. So when we look at the intersection between generations and broad beverage category choices, we can assess what are some of the drivers and drainers, right? So the report goes into more detail on this, but if we look at, there are a few growing combinations that are adding billions of servings to the Canadian landscape, and some declining combinations that are drawing from it, leaving us with that net decrease of 2 billion. So as I mentioned, the report will go into a little bit more details on these, but here today, just to look at what are the key drivers. So out of these growing combinations, just to give some idea of what we can expect and what is driving for the future. This again, this is just a variation, not necessarily the size, and in reference to the total landscape. But looking at our top 10 growing beverage by generation combinations, we really see here a mix of younger cohorts, so Gen Alpha, trailing Gen Z, leading Gen Z are all present here in the top 10 combinations, which out of that growth that we saw, even though there were close to 30 combinations growing, we really see that the top 10 account for most of it. We see the presence here of both dairy alternatives and functional beverages, which will include juices, water, so include juices and other categories around that. And here we also see, again, different variety of categories themselves, lots of presence of coffees, CSDs, and even some alcoholic beverages there. Again, this is just one way of looking at it. We can break out coffee by subsegments, CSD between diet and regular, as well as functional beverages within a multitude of the categories present. But this just shows a positive outlook in terms of the generations and the categories that are growing. So as a quick recap, as we were mentioning, generations really matter, and using a generational lens is key to understand what, why, and how Canadians are drinking today. And most importantly, it will be important to understand how it's shaping for tomorrow, okay? So with that, moving into our second part, beyond just the generational dynamics, but looking at some of the other forces driving the beverage consumption. So today we will talk about two macro trends. These macro trends are a little bit broader and they have different facets for each one of them, but we'll look at conscious consumption. And for that one, we will assess alcohol moderation, functional beverages, as well as ESG factors. And we'll also look at evolving situational factors. So what has happened with the occasions in which we consume our commercial beverages, looking at inflationary pressures, how we're getting our beverages after the pandemic, as well as some of the evolution around the consumption occasions themselves. Okay. So moving to the first one, we see that Canadians are drinking less. This comes from our ACT study, and if we look from a trend in the past 5 years, we see that the drinking rate, which is the average servings per drinking, is decreasing around 5%. The drinking rate itself is composed of two other things. It's of the frequency, which is composed by the occasions per drinker, as well as the intensity, which is the servings per occasion. So when we look at the trend, what is driving the decrease in the drinking rate, the moderation of alcohol consumption, is mainly around the intensity. So the frequency hasn't changed much, but how much people are drinking in each one of those occasions has decreased. When we look at a broader trend from 10 years, we see the same trend happening with just stronger intensity. But as we've been seeing, and as we'll see further throughout the webinar, moderation means different things for different generations. So if we apply the same formula, but look at it from a few different cohorts, what we can see is young adults. So here you have your legally drinking age Gen Z and a few of the younger millennials. We see that their drinking rate is decreasing in line with the population, but the drivers are different. For them, it's the frequency that is decreasing. So they're drinking in less occasions, but whenever they're drinking, they're actually drinking a little bit more, which is a very different situation than, for instance, when we look at older millennials that are drinking less and at a higher intensity than the total population average. And for them, it's because it's a decrease in both the frequency and the intensity, right? With these younger consumers, among these younger drinkers who continue to consume alcohol, there's some interesting other trends around it. So there is a growing association of those drinking occasions with some health benefits, which can also help explain a little bit the perceived permission to continue drinking. And it's related a lot to the growth of hard seltzer sodas that are made with more natural ingredients. This actually brings us to our second point around functional beverages and health perception. So when we're talking about health and permissibility, reality is that health is very different today than it was a decade ago. Permissibility plays a lot of a big factor, and we see that it has changed to include other things. Our report really breaks it down and breaks down health and helps it expand beyond just the nutritional requirement to include also physical benefits and emotional well-being. So when we look at, for instance, on Canadian consumers that are looking for something health and nutritionist related, we see the majority of consumption is driven by a nutrient nourishment. So this is things that whenever choosing a choice based on, does it fit my weight loss, my dietary needs, is it probiotic? You see a lot of juices here, etc. We also see a strong growth in health being more and more associated with the strong emotional well-being, being in a positive state of mind. So here you have drinks like coffee, etc. And these account for a third of the occasions. And then you have physical recovery, which is a lot around energy boost and recovery. And we see a few of these are growing since the pandemic and also developed, particularly physical benefits developed versus comparison to total foods. Our report also captures different nutritional and metabolic drivers. So there's a lot of detail specifically on these, but we can see is from a top line perspective, most of these are growing since the pandemic, showcasing that there is a higher concern with health and metabolic drivers in general. But once again, when we're talking about this different health today and the permissibility, it looks differently across the generations. Right, so here, just as an example, taking Gen Alpha, millennials, and boomers, what we can see in terms of the metabolic drivers themselves, we see that for younger generations, Gen Alpha in this case, a lot of it revolves around bone health, lowering risk of diseases and boosting your immune system. For millennial, it's a lot more on cognitive function, memory, reducing inflammation, helping with joints, all of those things that happen the moment you turn 30. And then with boomers, it's much more around weight management and supporting digestive health. We see this reflected in the development of different labels as well when people are choosing their beverages. So with Gen Alpha, a lot of it is just around the nutritional enrichment, the vitamins that are contained in the drinks. For millennials, we see a lot more labels regarding probiotic, being plant-based, fresh, natural things. And for boomers, a lot more around nutrition facts and intake management. So really, even with something with health and permissibility, we really see that there are some different focuses. For Gen Alpha and trailing Gen Z for big part, it's a lot more around proactive health and fundamentals. As if with millennials, it's much more active functionality based on things that I need. And for boomers, you see more of that nutritional traditionalist approach. Okay. And again, segueing complementary to those health benefits, when we look at other conscious consumption drivers, in our study, we capture a unique set of conscious consumption drivers, I think over 20 drivers that really help understand what are strongly influencing consumption choices. So when we look at those, the top 5 are still around the quality, high quality products, Canadian made. You see product freshness, quality ingredient, food safety being the top ones. But when we look at what is growing in terms of conscious consumption drivers versus last year, we see things around the environment, carbon neutrality and regenerative farming, environmental impact, really growing fast. Same thing reflected in labels. Labels around non-GMO, vegan, and recyclable are also growing very fast compared to previous years. And once again, when we look at conscious consumption in ESG, they are broad, and when we look at it from different generations, we see different meanings for each one of them. So just on the conscious consumption drivers for leading Gen Z, the focus is way more, if we're thinking ESG, on the environmental component of it. When we're talking millennials with kids, adults, it's more on supporting local businesses, climate change, so almost around the S component of it. And with boomers, older cohorts, it's still where was it produced, the quality of the ingredients, the freshness. So they pretty much almost, you can make a proxy for the ESG being developed, each one of the letters being developed differently for each one of them. And again, similarly with labels, you kind of see the same thing with vegan, compostable, made with plant-based ingredients, be more developed with leading Gen Z, and then fair trade, locally produced with millennials, and things around quality and made in Canada be more developed with boomers. Okay. Interestingly enough, when we also look at our FSM study, so looking from food service, we also see that year over year, customers, food service customers continue to identify with these ESG paradigms. So one example that we have here, while supporting local restaurants is pretty much strong across the generations, Gen Z coffee drinkers, 1 in 3 of them still prefer local independent restaurants to chains. We see a development versus boomers and older generations on this. And we also see that Gen Z and millennials are 4 times more likely to avoid any animal products for both ethical and environmental reasons. Okay? So some of these interesting facts we can also see playing out in food service. So just as a recap for this first part on the macro trends, whether it's moderation, this expanded health benefits, or concern with a variety of issues, Canadians drinkers, they are more aware and conscious about their choices and a lot of the permissibility behind it, right? So again, while these trends are connected, they're still separate, but it's always important to keep in mind that while they are similar in essence, there's still a lot of nuances for each one of the generations, okay? Which brings me to the second macro trend around the evolving situational factors that follow a similar logic. The different trends that we'll look in each one of them are also connected, but they still manifest differently across the different age cohorts. So the first one that's always top of mind nowadays is around inflation. So as we wade deeper into an inflationary cycle, consumers today are really refocusing what value means to them. So based on our different motivations that we captured from 5, we created this measure called the value trigger, which is a composition of both good value for money and wanting to save money. So what we can see here is since the pandemic, there has been a growth in the value trigger, and it's driven mainly by the necessity and the need to save money, okay? So that's one of the important points. It's still worth mentioning that value per se is still a bigger component of the value trigger, but what is driving is an increased focus on saving money. So while that is worrying in a few cases, it's also worth mentioning that commercial beverages, the value trigger for commercial beverages, is underdeveloped when looking at total foods and in particularly meals. We know that the value trigger is highest when we're talking about meals and particularly dinner. So it's at the same time that we have this concern, it's still good to keep in mind compared to other food and beverage choices that for beverages, the impact is still a little bit smaller. But as we look at it, not all categories will be impacted equally by the value trigger. So the report really helps dig deeper on the implication that the value trigger has on this consumption. Again, based on an intersection of these generations and macro categories, we can really dig deeper and understand more. So here I don't want to spend too much time, but just in short, we have an exercise of looking at a willingness to spend opportunity matrix, where we look at both the development of value needs, as well as the development of looking for premium high quality ingredients. So this gives us a few different quadrants. On the top right, if they are developed in both value and premium, they're willing to spend. Here, it's low value consideration because they're both underdeveloped in value and underdeveloped in premium. Here, they're underdeveloped in value, developed in premium. Quality with value is when they're developed with wanting premium ingredients, but also looking for value. And then here being underdeveloped in premium while still looking for value. And again, not trying to spend too much time here, but when we look here at some different category, the intersection between category and generational groups, I want to highlight a couple of things for takeaway. First one is, you see alcoholic beverage categories here. They all figure on the willing to spend. And this makes sense because as a category that has less elasticity, alcoholic beverage consumptions are less impacted by the value trigger in general. And the second is just around the cohorts. We see here that both for hot and cold beverages, for boomers and Gen X, we see that they're also a little bit underdeveloped in terms of the value trigger. Okay. But it's not only the inflationary pressures on our pockets, but since the pandemic, how we're getting our drinks also changed a lot. So we see that since the pandemic, digital ordering for coffee more than doubled. So it was something that with everyone at home, these things became and really doubled in size. However, when we're comparing to foods, entries, and sides, we still see that for beverages in general, digital ordering is smaller. It's very underdeveloped. Okay? So this opens, in terms of implication, this opens an opportunity how to better leverage those technologies to enable upselling of beverages and delivery. This is even more important when we take into account that the beverage inclusion rate in different delivery and options is also decreasing a little bit over time. So this really represents an opportunity. The way we are getting our beverages is changing, but there's still a lot of opportunity to grow. Similarly, just keeping with coffee as an example here, on the report we look at it from different category lenses, but just here we can look from how we're getting our coffee, where we're getting it from a variety of ways. Here we wanted to look at a few different cohorts, so we can look at it from people working from home, if they're mainly at their workplace, as well as the generational lens. We wanted to bring attention in particular to trailing Gen Z and some of these younger consumers. They aren't the biggest coffee drinkers. Coffee in general is underdeveloped for them. They're more developed with the older cohorts. But the way they're drinking their coffee, the way they're sourcing their coffee, where they're sourcing it from, is still unique and changing faster. So sourced from out of home, this can be anywhere from a supermarket, a kiosk, or a food service itself. We see that it's very developed for trailing Gen Z, and it's growing very fast compared to these other cohorts. But at the same time, carried from home, so a coffee that I prepare at home, but I bring out of home to consume, while not particularly underdeveloped, is also growing. So these two combined really make the consumption out of home for trailing Gen Z of coffee really big. Again, they're not the biggest coffee drinkers, but it showcases a few different opportunities and habits that are different. And then finally, there's also been some changes around the occasions themselves. So what we are doing when we consume commercial beverages and who we are with. Okay? So it's no surprise that the pandemic made us very attached to the many screens we have. And those habits, to a large degree, have persisted. So when we combine TV and streaming, surfing the internet on your smartphone, these activities are the fastest growing since the pandemic, and combined, they now account for 40% of the drinking occurrences. Okay, so this is a big deal because talking, socializing, which was historically one of the bigger activities, is now on par with our time spent on screen while consuming beverages. But each one of these activities separately has different beverage developments. So when we look at watching TV, streaming, pretty much your Netflix occasion, we see the development of more indulged beverages. So CSDs and wine are particularly overdeveloped with these activities. On the other hand, when we're looking at browsing your smartphone, just scrolling through your phone, some other categories start getting developed, such as specialty coffee and iced coffee. So not only what we are doing, but we also see that drinking occasions are becoming a little bit more solo and a little bit more everyday. So there has been some rebound in social occasions versus last year, but we see that it's still below pre-COVID. And we can see pretty much similar trend on both social occasions. So if I was alone or with somebody else, as well as what we consider special occasions, if it was an everyday or a special occasion. So then we can see there is a rebound, but still below COVID levels. So this means that, again, these drinking occasions are becoming a little bit more solo, a little bit more everyday. And when we take the generational lens to it, situation becomes a little bit different. This is driven more exclusively by leading Gen Z and millennials with no kids. They're the ones really pushing in the last year this rise of social occasion. Because on the other hand, we see older cohorts like Gen X and Boomers and trailing Gen Z continue to lose social occasions, even with things reopening a little bit. Okay. So again, really important to understand all these different dynamics. So just to recap a little bit the macro trends consumption part, we looked at the generation landscape and seeing how the generations matter. We looked at a few of these trends and seeing how these consumption trends matter. And again, it's really important to understand that while they do share some similarities, they will impact all the different categories, the different generations. They either mean different things for them or they will impact them differently, okay? So again, these are some of the main trends that we have and the insights on the generations. Right now, we'll move a little bit more to hopefully inspire you with some activations by the specific category groups. Okay, so the idea here will be looking at a little summary on how these category groups are different from the total commercial beverage landscape, looking at a few highlights, and what are some potential implications that are happening right now. So looking at cold beverages, here we see, as with everything, there is a decrease in the annual drinkings per capita, but it's pretty much in line with total beverages. When we break out the different categories here, we see that CSD has been growing a lot with both adults and teens. Commercial waters is growing with older cohorts, but decreasing a little bit with the rest. And again, as the larger group, this is where we see that specific development by generation in terms of the consideration set. This is where the phenomenon of just younger generations having a larger consideration set than older generation happens. It's really amplified when we look at this cold beverage group. And in terms of label developments here, really that functional part. So a lot of these labels regarding intake management and purity are all developed with cold beverages, and they're even more developed with older generations. In terms of the occasions themselves, they're mainly solo, especially for adults. They're developed more in snacking occasions and with other activities such as exercising or physical, and then obviously in motivations. As you can see here, this is pretty much, as you might be able to see, where you're competing more with tap water, right? It's really that snacking occasion. The main motivational drivers are thirst and rehydration, and it's mainly around those solo occasions. So here, when we're thinking about some of these implications, this is the tap water battlefield. This is where you have to kind of reclaim those snacking occasions by adding more emotion and fun. So leveraging a bit of those different motivations, how you can make these occasions more attractive without forgetting the base that are those functional drivers, and never forgetting what they might mean for those different cohorts, whether it be the proactive health for younger generations, a more active functionality for leading Gen Z, younger millennials, or really that nutrition focus for older cohorts. Okay. Looking at hot beverages, again, this is a little bit smaller than cold beverages. We see, again, a decrease in the annual drinkings per capita, but in terms of decrease, it's the slowest out of the three groups that we're looking today. Here we see the rise of coffee and some of those other specialty coffees. What's decreasing a little or growing a little bit slower is tea. But when we start looking at development by generation, we see here boomers in particular being more developed with traditional brewed coffee and tea, and then younger generations having more of that appeal of specialty coffee, hot chocolate, some other things. But here, when we start looking again from the generational cohort and also looking at multicultural, there's some interesting things that show up. So multicultural young people and Western Canadians, traditional Canadians, very different. We see that hot beverages are particularly developed with Gen Alpha and trailing Gen Z. from multicultural origins, but there's still a big opportunity to develop them with more Western Canadian youth. In terms of the occasions, this is driven a lot by coffee and tea. We see that these are more high frequency drinkings that happen mainly in the morning and have more the functional approach of mental uplift while working and studying, which we can see here on the motivations, either from energy boost, habit, or comforting. But again, it's very driven by coffee in this sense, but we see a few opportunities. So taking again a quick look here, we see that hot beverages are growing, but they're also changing in nature, right? So when looking at the future, we're looking at those younger consumers. There are a lot of opportunities, and I think here that the pandemic has had a big impact, again driven by coffee, when we look at those venue strategies. So when we look at the hot beverage adoption journey, especially as consumers, especially for those younger consumers, where we get the coffee from really has a lot of opportunities as they will continue to evolve. So I think this offers both innovation offerings for operators. So focusing, I know it's about hot coffee, but obviously some of those specialty coffees and cold coffees have an opportunity here. But again, there's space for opportunity when we're talking about offerings for operators, but we can't forget about the portability opportunities for CPG companies as well. Okay. Then last but not least, looking at alcohol beverages. This is really where the decline in terms of annual drinkings per capita is a little bit steeper. Beer and wine have been a lot of those bigger drivers, but we do see a growth of other bev alc categories, such as the ready to drinks, the hard seltzers, that have some of that different approach. Okay? And again, very different developments by generation. We see wine being developed with boomers, spirits being developed with leading Gen Z, and millennials with kids really pushing the more development with beers. So here, when looking a little bit on the demographic, occasion, and motivations, there's some interesting things. So some of the traditionally more underdeveloped demographics for alcohol beverages, which include multicultural Canadians and female drinkers, they're still underdeveloped, but they are growing faster. So there is an emerging demographic and a changing landscape around there. And in terms of overdeveloped occasions, this is where we see kind of that social and special. Even though these occasions are declining a little bit, this is where alcohol is very developed, mainly in the evening, not surprising. And then we see kind of two different activities. One of them was that indulging, relaxing Netflix occasion that we saw the development with wine. But obviously, parties and social gatherings as activities are also very developed here for alcohol beverages. Okay. With motivations, I guess, not a lot of surprise in terms of many of them providing more of that emotional benefit of relaxing or uplifting being somewhat of a reward. And definitely in terms of underdeveloped motivations, more around doesn't make me feel guilty, wanting to save money, as we mentioned. These are some of the things that are underdeveloped for alcohol beverages. So here, when we think about some of the immediate implications and takeaways for this, it really goes around understanding the changing nature of the category, right? So this goes from both the demographic perspective, but also on the perception of health and moderation. So understanding what that moderation means for each one of the categories is very important, as well as having an appeal to these emerging demographics, but also an opportunity to reframe choices in communication around some of these new occasions. Okay, so just as an example, with the rise of these new social celebrations, we see that even though a lot of the social occasions seem to be declining a bit, there is still growth of some new things. So there's space to think outside the box here to really include this in different social celebrations. One example is just, as a new Canadian myself, big opportunity is always when you get your PR, when you get your citizenship, different holidays. There's a lot of different new rising occasions that are very important to have an appeal to. And also with these new occasions and new beverage preferences comes new pairing opportunities. So everyone always knows red wine and steak, but what about these new social occasions? Is that the right pairing for that relaxing Netflix occasion with these new drinkings that are emerging, with these new demographics? It's really important to think about these new pairing opportunities as well. Okay. So in closing, I know we just saw a lot of information. It's hard when you're talking about multiple beverage categories, multiple trends, and multiple generations, but we really just scratched the surface. And there's a lot more detail that we can dig into, customization opportunities for specific categories. But with all that being said, there's a few takeaways that I want to leave everyone with. First one of the first ones we mentioned, is that tap water isn't going anywhere. It's growing and it's changing when we consume commercial beverages, right? The prevalence that it has in snack occasions, anything that isn't a meal, is pushing commercial beverages more towards meals, especially dinner. The second one is when we look at a high level, the trend, we see that things are declining, we see tap water growing, but it's not all doom and gloom. When we dig deeper and we look below the surface, there is room for everyone to play when we look at those different categories. The prospect is bright of different categories growing with younger cohorts, and there's many opportunities for innovation when we look at the cross between these generations and all of the trends behind them. Okay. So really, to close it off, trends really do matter. Things have changed. Consumers nowadays look very different than they did 10 years ago. Heck, they look different than they did pre-pandemic. So it's really, really important that we all keep updating our foundational understandings of habits, drivers, and preferences of Canadian consumers. We are still living in very uncertain times, so these consumers all remain in transition. All of these trends keep changing. And again, one of the points that I mentioned in the beginning, in Canada, it's even different. The trends in Canada are different, and Canada will increasingly become more unique. Okay? So with all of that, thank you everyone for attending. The report will be available early in July. And either me or my colleague, Kathy Parada, will be reaching out to everyone after this. I also want to thank the amazing food and beverage team. Putting a report and a webinar like this really takes many hands, so I really can't thank them enough. Okay. So with that, thank you all very much. We'll open for a couple of questions. So just looking at a few here. So one, just in terms of accessing the report, as mentioning, Kathy Parada will follow up with a lot of the questions of people that attended. She will share both the recording and the deck if there's interest, so she will follow up with that. Okay. Another question here, just in terms of which categories have more prospect of growth in the future. I think, as we mentioned in one of the takeaways for hot beverages, but more encompassing than that, I believe coffee is a very interesting category. It's been growing since the pandemic. It's been growing in the last year. But one of the very interesting things about coffee is that it's changing in nature. So it's not only the brew coffee that is growing, there's a different appeal by the different coffee types that we can understand for each one of the generations, as well as the different sourcing dynamics behind them. Finally, here we have around energy shots. The report looks into detail about energy drinks, and we can also look beyond to see on a subcategory level, as well as understanding broader motivations around everything encompassing invigorating and those physical benefits from the health drivers and functional beverages we were looking at. Okay, I think that was it. So with this, once again, I want to thank everyone for joining and look forward to reaching out. Stay tuned for follow-ups on the report. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.